Each year, more than 46 million Americans will seek emergency room treatment for an accidental injury, most of which are preventable. So, what are your risks, and who can you trust to protect you? This is Safety Matters with Russ Kenzior.
This is Russ Kenzior, and you're listening to Safety Matters.
Safety Matters in the news.
If you recall, last week I read part of an interview between Dr. Anthony Fauci and the actress Jennifer Gardner, where she was asking him about when would he think that people can kind of get back to normal and go back to the movie theaters, and when would the movie theaters be open. And he was quoted as saying, "I think it's going to be a combination of a vaccine that's been around for almost a year and good public health measures. I would think by the time we get to the end of 2021, maybe the middle of 2021. That's a quote from Dr. Anthony Fauci. So, unfortunately, those words now have some concrete consequences. Just this past week, the Wall Street Journal published a story entitled "Theater Chain AMC Says It Could Run Out of Cash by Year-End." Attendance is down by 85% on the same theater basis from last year, since reopening has begun. The story went on to say that the movie theater operator has reopened 494 of its 598 U.S. theaters, but attendance is down about 85% on a same theater basis from the same equivalent period last year. AMC said Tuesday at the company's current cash burn rate, reserves will be depleted by the end of this year or the early part of next year. It said that continued closures at about 17% of AMC's U.S. theaters have impeded the chain's hopes for the fall. Studios have also thrown a wrench into movie theaters' reopening plans by delaying several blockbuster releases. So Jennifer Gardner's conversation with Dr. Fauci is now, unfortunately, leading to some serious financial consequences for our nation's movie theaters. Another consequence was recognized by the World Health Organization, who put out a report this week stating that the World Health Organization has warned world leaders, against relying upon COVID-19 lockdowns to tackle outbreaks, after previously saying countries should be careful how quickly they reopen. So again, this is part of the misinformation that's coming from our national and global leaders. The story went on to say that WHO envoy, Dr. David Nabarro, said that restrictive measures should be treated as a last resort. The British magazine The Spectator reported in a video interview with him, quoting, "We in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as the primary means of control of this virus. The only time we believe a lockdown is justified is to buy you time to reorganize, regroup, rebalance your resources. Protect your health workers who are exhausted, but by and large, would rather not do it." And that's an end quote. So the World Health Organization now is strongly discouraging countries from relocking down, when initially they said that was actually the way to significantly curtail the spread of the coronavirus. In fact, a lot of the data we're seeing today is showing that the virus is picking back up, not only across the United States, but throughout all of Europe. And again, everyone's wearing masks, everybody's social distancing for the most part, using hand sanitizers. There's still a lot of folks that aren't leaving their homes, but this virus isn't going away, which means one thing: what we've been doing hasn't been that effective. Now, that's not to say social distancing and in some cases wearing face masks, face covers, which I'm going to be speaking about, face shields in the next segment. All of those help, but they're not remedies. And sadly, a lot of people are wearing face masks, face covers, thinking that that'll prevent them from contracting the coronavirus. Not so certain. Not so certain that's true. But there continues to be even more financial consequences. This past week, Fox News reported that New York City's coronavirus-era subway cars fill up at rush hour, and they're seeing a spread of coronavirus from people taking the subway. Photos from inside the rush hour subway trains last weekend showed commuters filling the seats with others forced to stand uncomfortably close. A vast majority of those wore masks, but little to no social distancing could be found in those cars, the story reported. It also went on to say that the crowded conditions of New York's public transit system was one of the major drivers of their epidemic, said Dr. Marty Markery, a professor of health policy and management at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. So, again, what we're hearing is the spread of the coronavirus. In this case, New York City is clearly linked to those taking public transportation, which sadly, what choice do they have? I mean, it's how you get around in the city. You take subways. But the story also went on to say that back in March, the governor ordered the closure of non-essential businesses. The state, and especially New York City, has been slow to reopen compared to other areas. City restaurants were allowed to open for indoor dining just a couple weeks ago, with restrictions still in place. The state comptroller said that, actually warned that 50% of the bars and restaurants in New York City could permanently close within the next 6 months due to the restrictions. The closures could mean the loss of up to $23 billion in taxable sales and 150,000 job losses. That produced $10.7 billion in wages. Again, ridership in the New York City subways are down by 32%, and it is hemorrhaging money. But one of the most fascinating parts of this story was a statement made by Rich Azzopardi, who's a senior advisor to Governor Cuomo. And this had to do with the question that was raised comparing subway users and restaurant guests. And because they've been shutting down restaurants, but have done very, very little with subways, people taking the subway. But Mr. Azzopardi said it's foolish, and this is a quote, it's foolish and disregards both science and recent history to compare restaurants to the subway as a means of contracting the coronavirus. Well, I would ask the question, why? How is it different? It's kind of like sitting in a movie theater. What's the inherent risk that would be different than, say, sitting on an airplane for 3 hours in close proximity to other people? Not certain why it isn't fair to compare various environments where people are behaving in almost identical ways for same periods of time. So, again, lots of confusion, not certain really where this is all going to take us. This is just continues to be an ongoing, almost like a slow bleed. The coronavirus is here. It's not going anywhere. We're getting misinformation left and right. It just really is a issue that has gotten way out of control. And there are some states and some countries that have been far more effective than others. But based on what we're hearing, it's going to be around for a while. When we come back, I'm going to speak a little bit about face shields. There's been a lot of research, allegedly, on face masks. Very little research that I've been able to find on face covers. That's a modified pull your t-shirt over your nose. But there is some published research on face shields. You know, the plastic panel that people wear, kind of a headband, and it comes down over their face. And so we're going to talk about face shields when Safety Matters returns.
You're listening to Safety Matters with Russ Kensier.
Welcome back to Safety Matters. This is Russ Kensier. You may have already seen the video this past week that came out showing Vice President Joe Biden at a speech that he was delivering in Las Vegas, whereby he actually lowered his mask. He pulled his face mask off of his face to cough into his hand, and then with the same hand put the face mask back on his face. And, I guess you can make fun of Vice President Joe Biden for doing that, but I think that's what many people do. I mean, I would think that that's a very common occurrence. In fact, I see that all the time where people are touching their face mask, touching their eyes, putting their face mask in their pocket, contaminating it. Remember, these types of face masks are not intended to be used as people are using them. But it is a interesting kind of psychological effect that it has on people. And I'm sure in the years to come, we're going to find out just how effective face masks and face covers have been. But there's an interesting story that was just published last week by the American Medical Association in the Journal of American Medicine, dated October the 6th. And this was a study, a research study that was performed in India. And what they found is workers in India that were treating patients, while the workers were wearing both a face shield and a face mask, there was 0% of the workers contracting coronavirus or anyone within their family. And that was really what the study was about. The concern was, are health workers contaminating PPE, bringing the virus home, maybe infecting their family members or others around them. And the evidence from the Journal of American Medicine says, hey, if you're wearing a face shield and a face mask, that offers some real tangible benefits. Now, okay, we can get carried away here. And by the way, face shields are those clear plastic plates that you see people walking around with a kind of like a headband over their head. There's effectiveness there, but again, at what risk? At what point do you say enough is enough? Again, if you're touching your face, touching your eyes, and that's really, I think, one of the things that the study didn't highlight specifically, but if you're wearing a face shield and somebody coughs at you or near you, it kind of deflects it. Although we've all been told that the primary means of entry is by breathing, and it is a respiratory virus, so that would make a lot of sense. Remember, your eyes and your mouth are still receptive to the virus. So if you touch your eyes, you can contaminate your eyes and get the virus the same way as you would if somebody was to cough and you inhaled it. But it was rewarding to see that there's finally some research emerging about coronavirus, and in this case, related specifically to face shields. There was another revelation this week, and it was one that came out on the Tucker Carlson show, and this was a story about a researcher from China, a virologist by the name of Dr. Li Meng Yan, who is a former postdoctorate student at the Hong Kong University. And Dr. Yan had fled her country, came to the United States, and appeared on the Tucker Carlson show to talk about how she had scientific proof or evidence that the Chinese Wuhan virus, COVID-19, was in fact fabricated, created in a Chinese laboratory. Now, what was really most surprising about this story is the fallout afterwards. There have been really no scientists, both in the United States and outside, that have given this any credibility. In fact, people in the scientific community are mocking her. They're making fun of her. A good example of that is the alleged fact-checking organization Snopes said Dr. Yan's statements are just outright false, and that they're not based on peer-reviewed data, and therefore have not gone through the rigors of editorial review, which would be, of course, evaluated by her peers, scientific experts, with that extra degree of scrutiny. Now, that's true. That is true. But on the flip side of that, why dismiss her allegations so quickly? That was the question that came to my mind as someone that does work in research. If somebody comes out with a research paper, you certainly give it every opportunity to fail based on its merits. And it was really shocking how Dr. Anthony Fauci responded to this research. In fact, he did an interview just a week or so ago for National Geographic magazine. It was a very lengthy interview, but here's a little bit of what Dr. Fauci had to say.
One topic in the news lately has been the origins of SARS-CoV-2. I mean, do you believe, or is there evidence that SARS-CoV-2 was made in the lab in China or accidentally released from a lab in China?
Well, there's two issues. If you look at the evolution of the virus in bats and what's out there now, is very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated, the way the mutations had naturally evolved. A number of very qualified evolutionary biologists have said that everything about the stepwise evolution over time strongly indicates that it evolved in nature and then jumped species. One of the issues of saying, could that virus that was in, first of all, if you accept the premise, which is very strongly supported by scientific evidence, that it was not deliberately mutated and deliberately changed, and you say, if it was in the wild and evolving, the likelihood it jumped species naturally. Someone will say, well, maybe somebody took it from the wild, put it in the lab, and then it escaped from the lab. But that means it was in the wild to begin with. So that's why I don't get what they're talking about. If it isn't manipulated in the lab, and you're trying to say it escaped from the lab, then how did it get in the lab? It got in the lab because somebody isolated it from the environment.
Exactly. Somebody isolated it from the environment. His statement that said this could not have been artificially created. How does he know that? I mean, Dr. Fauci doesn't have any more scientific basis for his opinion than anybody else. I mean, the Chinese have been far from forthcoming as relates to this virus. No one has been permitted into their labs. Everything's been shut down. In fact, Dr. Yan, once she published her research, her mother was put in jail. I mean, this woman's given up a lot to go out on a limb. And if this is some kind of a wild goose chase or some big joke or propaganda push by her, well, she certainly paid a very high price already. But the statement that somehow this couldn't jump species, that it started in nature and somehow jumped species, and that just couldn't happen. I mean, Dr. Fauci's mocking Dr. Yan, kind of laughing at her, which I thought was just very distasteful, uncalled for, because what he was saying was based on nothing, really. I mean, what proof does he have of that? For example, what if the bats that were being researched in Wuhan that had this virus were worked on, or the virus is extracted from them and genetically modified, where the genome, and this is, by the way, what Dr. Yan is saying happened, that the viral genome was manipulated in such a way that it would jump from bats to humans. So the genome was modified. They took a virus that in nature would not jump from a bat to a human, but modified it in such a way that it could or would, and that somehow that virus got out of the lab and infected people. Now, that's a plausible argument. I don't understand why Dr. Fauci thinks that's somehow not plausible. What's, again, a bigger concern is how the scientific community has dismissed Dr. Yan. And so I have a good friend who is a researcher at a major lab in the United States. And I said, well, how could that be? We talked about it, and he said, well, understand a couple of things. Number one, a lot of research dollars that are being funneled to the research community is coming from China. China is a big player in the research arena, and therefore there would be a financial cost-benefit relationship here, where researchers who would otherwise be eligible for Chinese money to perform their research might get the door slammed in their face. That's plausible. Number two, surprisingly, I did not know this, but many of the people performing scientific research in the United States are Chinese nationals, people from China here in the United States, and they're performing such research. So there certainly is a lot more to look at or investigate as relates to this story. And again, I just found it very distasteful that Dr. Fauci kind of mocked her, made fun of her. Certainly doesn't speak well for him, especially since he has really no better theory than she does. Coming up next, I'm going to be interviewing a safety expert about distraction. Distractions are one of the more common contributing factors or causes to many types of injuries, workplace and injuries at home. And we all live in a world where we are multitasking. And multitasking oftentimes means we're not fully concentrating on one thing as we are doing multiple things at the same time. So we'll be talking about the effects of being distracted or distractions have on health and safety.
Safety Matters with Russ Kenzier will be right back.
This is Russ Kenzier, and welcome to Safety Matters. Have you ever found yourself being distracted while driving home or while on the job? Ever drove into the driveway of your home and, gosh, don't even remember how you got home? You don't even remember the drive? Or how often do you or your coworkers, members of your family, been distracted by cell phones? Well, if you're like most people, this is a common issue, and one that most people rarely even consider. According to the National Safety Council's 2018 injury facts, the top 3 workplace injuries are overexertion, slips, trips, and falls, and struck by objects. What's interesting is all 3 of those play directly into distractions. In fact, being distracted is one of the leading causes of workplace injuries. We're so often distracted, we don't even see it as a problem. Distracted workers can also be deadly. In June of 2009, Air France Flight 447 from Rio to Paris plummeted into the ocean because of a pilot being distracted. In fact, the pilot assumed that the autopilot was on when it was not. The plane stalled and plummeted into the ocean, killing all 228 passengers. Or in May of 2015, when a distracted railroad engineer was blamed for a deadly train crash in Philadelphia. But the same is true for off the job. In fact, each year, dozens of children will die as a result of being left behind in the car due to a distracted parent. Joining me today is Danny Smith, Senior Consultant with SafeStart. Danny, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Russ. Thanks for having me today. Great to be a part of this.
Well, tell us a little bit about yourself and SafeStart.
All right, very good. First of all, I work as a safety consultant with SafeStart, one of the senior consultants there, as you mentioned. And we're a bit different when you think about safety companies, if you will. Our focus is not on traditional safety or traditional safety compliance. We look at more so an awareness-based process that we go through, just getting people to think a bit more about their safety. We like to call it human factors, and thinking about the human factors that are involved in the things that we do on a day-to-day basis, not only at work, but also at home and while we're on the road as well. So we try to look at this as very much a 24/7 process, which I think really feeds well into the subject we're talking about today with distractions.
Well, your company has a really good list of webinars and information on your website. In fact, the one entitled "Focus on Distraction to Improve Safety," which is an on-demand webinar, is really incredible. In fact, that webinar taught me quite a bit. For example, you talk about phantom phone calls. Tell the audience a little bit about how your phone and phantom phone calls can be a distraction.
You know, the phone is probably one of the biggest distractions that we face. And I think one of the reasons for that is a lot of people think about this in terms of, well, perhaps if we have a hands-free phone device, which we see in a lot of vehicles now today. But the problem really isn't that our hands are occupied. The issue really is that we don't just drive with our hands and our feet, we drive with our minds. And if you think about the idea of a phantom phone call, let's say you've got your phone in your pocket, whether you're driving or not, and suddenly you have something that, well, I thought my phone just went off. Well, did it or did it not? Same thing applies if you're driving down the highway and maybe you personally have made the decision, I am not going to text while I'm driving. I'm not going to talk on the cell phone while I'm driving. So let's just say your phone is there in the cup holder and you hear that magic little bing and someone just sent you a text or an email. The natural tendency is to take that glance down and just look and see who it was that sent that call. And some of the studies that I've looked at as I prep to do some of the conference presentations I do on distracted driving, which I think those concepts really apply in, not only in driving, but also throughout our life. But one of the studies I've looked at says that the average distraction is about 4 to 5 seconds, even if it's just glancing down to see who it was that sent you the text. And if you're driving along on the interstate doing 70 miles an hour, you're traveling about 100 feet per second, and that means you just went 450 feet or something like that. So basically a football field and a half at least, just in a glance down to look at that little text, and that little distraction that you had there.
It always seems that little ding goes off at the absolute worst time. I mean, just when you don't want it to go off, it does. I also learned about something that you guys talk about, and that's moral panic, where the media actually plays a role in getting people. And here we are in the world of coronavirus, where everybody's anxious and panicky and scared and worried, and we can keep going. But let's talk a little bit about media and the work that is being done by your organization as it relates to moral panic.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and I'm sure I'm not alone in this. It's ironic, really, if we're doing this on a talk radio format, and we talk about some of the things with media that can be distractions that are out there. And for sure, I'm sure I'm not the only one in this boat. I listen to talk radio a lot, be it sports or news, you name it, and true confession time here. I actually talk back to the radio as I'm driving along. I argue with the host quite often. In fact, my wife will reach over and pat me on the leg at times as she's driving with me, and she'll say, "Honey, they can't hear you." But it makes me feel better, to talk back and say the things that I do back to whoever the host is. But, think about this. And let's use driving. We use driving a lot in some of our training processes because it's something that, regardless of the industry that we're training in, it's a very common task. And we, again, believe some of these things that we talk about can be used universally. If we learn them on the job, we can use them while we're on the road. If we do something that applies on the road, we can use it when we're at home. We can use it when we're back at work. But if you think about it, there's a lot of different types of distractions out there. There was a study by the Governor's Highway Safety Association a few years back that talked about 4 types of distraction: visual distractions, auditory distractions, manual distractions, fiddling with something in the vehicle, like the GPS, the radio, air conditioning, you name it. But probably the most dangerous of all, I think, is the 4th type that they talked about, and that was those cognitive distractions. And it's very, very easy for us just to kind of zone out at times or become so focused on the subject that's being talked about on the radio or whatever it is that it can just kind of consume us and get us to forget what we're actually doing and forget our primary task at hand, which is obviously driving. And I think the same thing happens as well in other environments, not just on the road, but certainly at work as well.
That's another good point. Imagine going in for surgery and you have a distracted surgeon, or a life or death situation, like being a pilot or a railroad engineer. You also talk about directed attention, where people are in boring, kind of redundant jobs that require a lot of focus, and the mind just tends to wander.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. We use the term complacency a lot in our training because I think complacency goes right hand in hand with some of those cognitive distractions. If you think about it, it's not like any of us get up in the morning and think, "Oh, wow, this is just a great day to get injured." I mean, nobody got up this morning, rolled out of bed and say, "Man, I'm thinking stitches today," or broken femur. I mean, we don't do that. We get up and we want to, pardon the pun, we use it a lot in industry, or the statement in industry, we want to come back home the same way we left home. We want to, continue to be healthy, if you will. But complacency can be such a really, really devastating thing for us. And here's the thing: complacency is something that happens naturally. There's nothing we can do to stop complacency. It's not a question of if we're going to be complacent. It's a question of when. And really, it happens pretty rapidly with us, I think. What it really breaks down to is, if you think about it, when you begin a new task, whatever it is, you're pretty aware of the hazards once you've been trained with that. I would say almost hyper aware to start with, but then over time, it gets to the point as our skill sets get a little bit better, that our mind can start to wander a bit, and we're no longer preoccupied with that risk. And when that happens, our exposure to the risk, whatever it is, be it in industry or driving or whatever, it goes up. And ultimately, we get so comfortable working around the hazards that we're not even thinking about them anymore, unless there's some kind of external stimulus that kind of brings us back to the moment. And if you apply that in the idea of driving, just real quickly here, if you're driving along and you see an automobile accident on the side of the road, you may have been complacent for the few miles prior to that, but suddenly you're going to have a spike in your awareness level because of that accident. Or if you see the police officer on the side of the road with the radar gun, your awareness is going to go up for a few miles. But unfortunately, that spike is really short-lived, and it drops back off really quickly. And part of that, it's just the way our brains work. It puts things that we deem as non-essential kind of in the back of our mind, and we do kind of, for lack of a better term, go on autopilot.
Well, it seems like a lot of the repetitive jobs are going to be replaced with AI, artificial intelligence. In fact, if you go to a automobile manufacturing plant today, all those monotonous jobs of welding cars and just much of the assembly process, that really caused a lot of failures with automobiles, just as far as quality. Well, those are being replaced by AI. And so we're probably going to see more AI in replacing humans in jobs that are monotonous, boring, that really kind of play into the preoccupation issue, just in general. Again, we're speaking with Danny Smith, senior consultant with SafeStart. What is it that our audience can do, Danny, to avoid being distracted, or at least be safely distracted?
Yeah, and I think that's the key. Kind of like with complacency, as we said a minute ago, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And I think that's the case with distractions as well. It's not a question of if we become distracted. Again, that's the way our minds work. So one of the things that we talk about a lot is trying to find techniques that will help us to compensate for that complacency. The neuroscientists refer to what they call preferred neural pathways. And I'm not going down the neuroscience trail today, so everybody don't change channels on us real quickly here. But basically, these are the things that we can do automatically without having to stop and think about them. And again, it's just something that we have learned through the years, and as our brains have developed, it's the way that we do things. Give you an example from the safety world. Everyone knows that when you're walking up or down stairways, that it's a great idea to use the handrail. But you had to learn to use the handrail. And you started that process, first of all, by approaching a set of steps and looking and saying to yourself mentally, hold the handrail. And your hand went out to do that. But over time, if you continue to practice that as a habit, eventually it gets to the point is when you walk up to a set of steps that your hand automatically goes out. That's when you've developed true habit strength. That's when you have developed, again, as a neuroscientist would call it, that preferred neural pathway. You've developed that habit to the point where it happens automatically, where you don't even think about it. And we can do that with a lot of other things as well. And what we have found is that helps to compensate for those times when we get complacent. The problem is there's a lot of junk science out there, I think, when it relates to things like habits. We've all heard the comment, you do something 21 days in a row and it becomes a habit, or this, that, and the other. And that's really not true. It actually takes much, much more repetition to do that. And it's usually, something like 60 plus times actually is what they say now, that you have to do something. And even then, a good habit can be undone by starting to practice a bad habit, even if it's unwillingly practicing a bad habit. We've all heard the phrase "practice makes perfect." I think that's a lie. Practice makes permanence, and I always say you can practice doing something the wrong way and get really good at screwing it up every time. If you don't believe that, check out my golf swing sometime.
Well, Danny, we appreciate you spending the time with us today. How can folks get in touch with you?
All right, very good. You can visit our website, which is very simple. It's SafeStart, SafeStart.com. Or if you'd like to email me, you certainly can do that as well. That is just real simply Danny, DANNY, at SafeStart.com. And would love to answer any question you have about this or any other subjects as it relates to human factors and safety.
Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Welcome back to Safety Matters. This is Russ Kensior. Last week, I spent some time talking about fire extinguishers, the different types of fire extinguishers, the ABC, the different types of applications of fire extinguishers, which one you use on what type of fire, which ones you should carry in your car versus the type you should have in your kitchen. But fires also come in all different types. Not every type of fire is the same. And one story that's been really kind of avoided here in the last few weeks, but was a massive story all summer, was the fires that have been raging across our western states, California, Oregon, and Washington. There have been dozens of people who have died, thousands displaced in those three states, and it has been nothing short of an absolute disaster. There's been so many people impacted by the wildfires on the West Coast, and it raises the question, how is it that those states, predominantly California, continue to see so many wildfires? Well, some would argue it's global warming, that the Earth is changing in terms of temperature, the temperatures are changing as to affect tree growth, undergrowth of trees, and because of droughts being created by global warming, the fires on the West Coast have become really apocalyptic. But you have to ask the logical question, which is, well, why aren't they happening anywhere else there's large numbers of trees? For example, the state that has the most number of trees, forest land, is Maine. Maine has more trees per capita per square mile in their forests than California or Oregon or even Washington State. So why aren't the trees burning, and why don't we hear about widespread forest fires in other states? Well, there's a couple of answers to that. A lot of it is political, but some of it is based on science. So let's stick to the science. One of the reasons is dead tree removal. A lot of the trees that are not properly maintained in densely populated forests, when the tree dies, the tree becomes fuel for fires. And so any type of spark or any type of ignition source that may trigger a fire somewhere in the forest will quickly spread because of dead trees. Now, some states have actually made it almost impossible to remove trees, including dead trees. In fact, in California, you need a permit in many cases not only to cut down a tree, but to remove dead trees, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. But why are the trees dying? Is it the drought? I mean, why are the trees dying? What's causing trees to die? And I would assume, trees die, right? Everything dies. Everything has a life cycle and it dies. And by simply not removing the dead trees, you're creating fuel. Well, there's another explanation. And in California, it's called the bark beetle. Bark beetles have really just terrorized the state of California. And they're not necessarily dangerous under normal circumstances, but they weaken trees. So when a bark beetle gets into a tree, and one reason they allegedly can get into the tree is lack of water from prolonged drought. So if there's a lot of dry timber, these bark beetles will attack the tree, they'll penetrate the tree, and they'll weaken the tree as it causes them to die. In fact, they say that more than 102 million trees, mostly conifers, these are trees that have a high level of oil in them, like pine trees, have already died from the drought and the bark beetles in California. So the bark beetles are coming about by way of the drought. So maybe there's some angle with global warming. It's still a bit of a stretch, but it's actually a beetle that's killing the trees, not the drought, at least directly. And so what can be done? What are Californians able to do? What is anybody able to do as it relates to these bark beetles. Well, one thing that's recommended is thinning overgrown trees, removing dense underbrush. If you have a lot of trees in your backyard, you're not necessarily living in a forest, but you have a lot of trees. You perhaps have a mini forest in your backyard, as do your neighbors. Keep watering. Keep the conditions wet. The wetter the trees remain, the less likely the bark beetles will propagate and infect the trees. Another source of these fires is blamed on equipment use. People who are driving their cars on dry grass or brush. They may have a hot exhaust pipe or muffler that can start a grass fire. The grass fire quickly, spreads. And now what started with a very small fire became a massive blaze. And so there's a lot of concern about restricting vehicles in locations where there's dry underbrush. And that makes perfect sense. In fact, that's kind of what we all learned about fire safety. In California, they actually are using what's known as fire-resistant landscaping. Yeah, fire-resistant landscaping. That's where you go about planting plants, placement of patios, decks, that sort of thing, rocks, flower beds, gardens, in a way that creates natural break points. So if a fire is to start, the ignition does begin, it won't be able to jump or move very quickly because of the use of fire-resistant plants. So if you're planting trees very close to your house, especially conifers, trees that have a lot of natural saps or oils, they just go up really fast in flames. So they're recommending to use hardwood trees, maples, poplars, cherry trees, because they're less flammable than your pines, your firs, and other conifers. So better landscaping techniques. And then a final point is what's triggering these fires is target shooting. That's right. The state of California is stating that people who are going out into the forests and discharging weapons, firearms, are perhaps contributing to igniting fires. So they're asking that people be a little bit more diligent in where and how they place targets. Don't place them in areas where there's dry grass. Put them in areas like dirt or gravel. Use the right types of targets, non-metal targets, because if a bullet is to ricochet off of a steel target, it might ignite or create a spark. They're saying to be careful what type of ammunition you're using. Certain types of ammunition may spark, more likely to spark or create a spark than others. This one's a natural. Exploding targets. Yeah, well, don't use an exploding target in the forest. That's probably a bad idea. Don't use incendiary or tracer ammunition. Those are the ones that have the high burning phosphorus in them, tracer rounds. And of course, bring a fire extinguisher with you. So if you're living in an area that fires from forest fires are just an epidemic and you're concerned about your family and your business and your neighbors, what can you do? Well, according to the website readyforwildfire.org, they say that you should create a wildfire action plan. And the action plan is actually pretty logical and pretty simple. Number one, create a designated meeting location outside of the fire or hazard area. This is critical to determine who has safely evacuated from the area. And if you recall, we hear all the time how many people wind up going missing during a widespread of fires, forest fires, and they don't know if they're missing, they don't know if they're alive or dead or wherever they are. So number one, create a meeting location for everyone to rendezvous at. Secondly, there's different escape routes that you need to take and prepare for from your home and your community. Practice how you're going to actually get out. If you live in a part of California where your home has one entrance, that's probably going to create a higher level of risk if you needed to evacuate, and that one means of discharge, that one road, is now blocked because of fire. But you need to have a second escape route. Number three, have an evacuation plan for your plants. for your pets and your large animals, not your plants. They're probably burned by then. But make sure your pets and large animals, horses, livestock, are properly prepared to be evacuated as well. Otherwise, they're probably most likely going to perish if, in fact, there's a fire. And lastly, have a home family communication plan that designates an out-of-area friend or relatives as a point of contact. So if we get separated as a family, we have somebody that we all understand we're going to call. And so let's call, Uncle Bob in Las Vegas, and he's going to be our contact point. So if we do, for whatever reason, get separated, we all are going to call one central person. And that way we will be able to, have a sense of communication. But it concludes by saying, remember the 6 Ps. Remember the 6 Ps. The 6 Ps are people and pets, papers, phone numbers, and important documents. They need to be prepared for in an evacuation. Number 3 is prescriptions, vitamins and eyeglasses. Make sure you're taking those with you. Pictures and irreplaceable memorabilia. I think that's one of the most heartbreaking parts of fires is when a family has to leave and by the grace of God, their children and pets are all safe. But when they go back to their home, it's gone. There's absolutely nothing left. All their history, photographs, videos, whatever it might be, all their memories are gone. And you can't replace those. So have a plan to have them in a place that if you need to evacuate, you can get as much of that out as you can. The next P is personal computer, hard drive and disks. And a lot of people keep their photographs, family information on a hard drive and or disk drive or the computer. So have a computer designated in your home that has all of that critical information on it. So if you have to up and leave, you grab the laptop and away you go. And then the final P, which for many people is the most important P, is plastic. That being credit cards, ATM cards, and of course, cash. You have to have some means of funding when you are out of your home and may need to rent a hotel, maybe you have to rent a car, purchase food, etc. And so remember the 6 Ps. The 6 Ps is the secret to surviving a forest fire. Well, thanks again for listening to the show. Look forward to you joining me next week.